Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science, and this is module 6 on hazards. Video number 13 is going to continue our little series on climate phenomena and ecosystems, and this time we're going to look at droughts or floods. As with the others in this series, what we need to do is to evaluate the causes and impact of climate phenomena on a local ecosystem, and this time we're going to focus in on droughts or floods. We've grouped droughts and floods together because they are a phenomena associated with the El Nino or La Nina effects. And so by having another look at the Southern Oscillation Index, something that we studied in the Year 11 course, we can get a bit of an idea about whether or not we're likely to expect more drought-like or flood-like conditions, and as a result of that to determine what sort of impacts they might have on the local environment. Dorothea Mackellar published a poem in the very early 1900s called My Country, and one of the stanzas in that poem is incredibly well known and hopefully familiar to you. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. What's most interesting about this section of Dorothea Mackellar's poem is that Australia is described as a land of droughts and flooding rains, and that is what we're looking at in this particular video. So what we have to do is we have to look at the relationship between the El Nino or La Nina effects and the Southern Oscillation Index. And what we find is that both droughts and floods across New South Wales are often tied to these conditions associated with the movement of air across the Pacific Ocean. The consequence of that is that if we can have a look at the ENSO, or the El Nino and Southern Oscillation, we can start to see some fairly regular patterns in how we enter El Nino events and La Nina events, and also the correlation between those different events and times of very hot, dry conditions and times of higher rainfall. So we want to try and have a look at this relationship between the Southern Oscillation, the El Nino and the droughts, and the La Nina and the above average rainfall events that can lead to flooding. So the Southern Oscillation is basically a bimodal variation in sea level barometric pressure between observation stations at Darwin and Tahiti. That's where we're looking at the difference between these two. So low pressure over Darwin and high pressure over Tahiti encourages a circulation of air from east to west, and this draws warm surface water westward and brings precipitation to Australia and the Western Pacific. So it's looking at differences associated between two different points separated by a reasonable distance to see if we can get some idea of the types of weather that we can expect as a result. Now you can see in behind this particular slide as a backdrop, I've given you a bit of an idea of the Southern Oscillation and the El Nino events, which are sort of the red ones above that zero line, and the blue La Nina conditions, which are the ones that are below that line. And so we can see a kind of bit of a pattern developing in these oscillations. When the pressure between those two stations of Darwin and Tahiti weakens, the difference when the pressure differences start to drop, these tend to give us the El Nino conditions. So parts of the Western Pacific, like Australia, will start to experience drought. So we're looking at the relationship between drought conditions and El Nino events as indicated by the Southern Oscillation Index. At this time across the ocean, heavy precipitation can bring flooding to the west coast of equatorial South America, a reverse effect that's happening either side of the Pacific Ocean. So if we're getting the droughts, they're getting all the flooding. And this is one of the important things to remember about these air masses moving, differences in pressure, the result of the formation of clouds, where they form and where they drop their rain. And this can allow us to start to make some of these better predictions about what we think might be happening as a new year approaches. By monitoring the ENSO conditions, we primarily focus on sea surface temperatures and particularly any anomalies that may exist in 4 distinct geographical regions around the equatorial Pacific, because this starts to give us an idea about whether there are warmer or cooler conditions. We've talked about temperature gradients. Now we're seeing differences in temperature, even small differences in temperature, slight rising favoring El Nino events, a slight lowering, and we're starting to favor the La Nina events. So this is how important relative temperatures are around the Pacific region in particular, and how they can affect our weather and climate. In order to try and be more consistent in terms of its predictive power, we try and smooth out some of those peaks and troughs to try and get a bit more of a sense of where the trend pattern is lying. And so hopefully by looking at these trends, we can start to get a little bit more confident in our prediction about what might be happening in terms of droughts or floods. But remember, the key to this section is to be able to link that potential hazard into its impact on the ecosystem. And I guess probably one of the biggest things to think about in terms of droughts, and droughts have such an incredible impact on the Australian environment, but the problem with them is that they're often broken by flooding rains. So when the drought actually breaks, the rains are often so heavy that they can lead to flooding. Now, one of the reasons that they can do this is because droughts themselves can often create a reduction in the vegetation cover, which means we've got a greater chance of erosion, particularly wind erosion, as that reduces the topsoil, as it removes a lot of that topsoil. And also that exposure means that it's more likely that when the rain does come, it's going to create its own erosion events. One of the most significant effects of drought, of course, is on the natural waterways, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of natural waterways, rivers, lakes, streams, billabongs drying up or dried up as a result of the lack of rainfall. Now, many plants and animals rely on these sources of water for their livelihood, for their growth, and so therefore as these water supplies start to shrink, start to diminish, so we have a big flow-on effect on the native plants and animals, as well as agriculture that's been established in these regions. So a lot of that, for example, was established along the Murray-Darling river systems. And so when they're in drought conditions, you get a significant drop in the water levels, and you get a big impact on the both the native and the introduced species in the environment. As I mentioned, wind can play its factor in eroding the upper layers of soil, particularly if drought's been around for a long time, because a lot of those plants are going to die back. But we do see in Australia quite a number of different organisms have either parts of their life cycle or specific structures that help them to survive in these very dry, very arid conditions. And we know that there's also some plants and animals that show particular adaptations to regular drought. So we do have things like spinifex grasses, and we also have things like the water-holding frog, which is able to basically get itself into a little watertight container and stay there until the next rain comes. So we see both in patterns of the behavior or the life cycle of particular organisms that they can cope for certain periods of time, even if there is a drought. Even things like kangaroos have particular strategies around their reproduction that can hold different young at different stages of development, both within the body and within the pouch, in order to survive or at least wait for conditions to improve. So kangaroos are capable of kind of manipulating their reproductive cycles in that way. And we see lots of different examples of Australian natives that have had to adapt to these kind of regular droughts and the sorts of strategies that they can use. The other side of that, of course, is floods. And flooding we've already talked about being linked to the East Coast lows. They are such damaging rains that they can lead to flooding. And in fact, at the time that I'm recording this, we've had some very significant weather events along the east coast of Australia from southern Queensland through now into Sydney, and it's creating huge problems in terms of flooding. Now, lots of water moving around can also pick up sediment and move it into places where we don't want it. Water can damage infrastructure, can damage buildings. We've seen some pictures of just how high some of the floodwaters are in places like Lismore. And we've also very sadly seen that flooding can even lead to death. And that death obviously can be human, but it will also include a lot of the animals, particularly burrowing animals that perhaps can't get away from the floodwaters, other animals that are unable to move to higher ground or move up to trees to get out of the way of these often very fast-moving floodwaters. Floods can result in habitat loss, in the dispersal of plants that are not desired in particular areas, which we generally call weeds. The redistribution of environmental chemicals, which could include herbicides and pesticides, fertilizers, things that have been used to try and control or support growth in agricultural regions, but even things like human waste, changes in fish production, the mixing of fresh and saline water around mangrove areas, and we get a lot of that sort of flushing happening as a lot of rain falls, and that just continues to flow to the lowest point. It can also have an effect on the water table. So lots of rainfall can lift that water table, and obviously again in low-lying areas that can bring that water even sometimes to the surface. And that can take some considerable time for it to dissipate. So there's lots of different consequences, or at least potential consequences on the ecosystem of both floods and droughts. We continue to try and look at the weather patterns, and I encourage you to do this, whether you do this on a news service or through the Bureau of Meteorology, the BOM, just to get a little bit of a familiarity with the types of patterns that you're likely to see and what sort of weather patterns might be associated with them. So again, have another look today when we've had a lot of rain at what sort of things that a synoptic chart like this is going to tell you about current weather, about potential future weather patterns, which way are winds moving, which way is air masses moving, are they coming across the land and therefore perhaps potentially might have lost any rain that they have? Are they coming from the ocean where they're probably quite there's probably a lot of rain that might be coming? And this is just a way of starting us down that process of trying to understand some of these extreme weather events that can be linked to things like the Southern Oscillation Index and East Coast lows. So this has been a lot of information. The droughts and the floods are two extremes of the same kinds of types of events, and they both have quite significant impacts on the local environment. Thanks for watching.